January 17, 1945. Brunswick, Lower Saxony. The morning air tasted of ash and spent cordite. Frau Margareta Schröder knelt beside the shattered remains of her kitchen window, her hands trembling not from cold, but from the impossible arithmetic of survival. 3 children, half a loaf of bread, no husband returning from the Eastern Front. Through the broken glass she could hear them, the low rumble of diesel engines, the unfamiliar cadence of English being shouted across cobblestone streets. The Americans had arrived in the night, and with them came the reckoning she had been taught to expect. The ministry's broadcasts had been clear: the enemy would show no mercy. They would take what little remained. They would make German mothers watch their children starve as payment for the Reich's ambitions. She pressed her daughter's ration card against her chest like a talisman, wondering which of her 3 she would be forced to choose when the soldiers came for their food. But what arrived at her door that afternoon was not vengeance. It was a can of condensed milk, still warm from the supply truck, placed on her threshold by a 19-year-old corporal from Iowa who couldn't meet her eyes when she wept. The end of the Second World War did not arrive as a single thunderclap, but as a series of small, profound dislocations. For millions of German civilians caught in the machinery of total war's collapse, the arrival of Allied forces represented an ontological crisis beyond the merely military. They had been conditioned by years of propaganda to understand their enemies in absolute terms as subhuman destroyers, as Jewish-controlled barbarians bent on the extinction of the German race. Goebbels' ministry had spent the final desperate months of the war saturating the public consciousness with apocalyptic visions: Soviet hordes committing unspeakable atrocities, American and British bombers deliberately targeting civilians, a future in which German children would be systematically starved as retribution. The Morgenthau Plan, leaked and weaponized by Nazi propagandists, seemed to confirm the worst fears, that the Allies intended to deindustrialize Germany, to reduce the nation to a pastoral graveyard where millions would perish from deliberate neglect. German mothers, in particular, had been positioned as the final guardians of the race, the last repository of German survival. They were told that when the Americans came, they would have to make choices no mother should make. That surrender would mean watching their children die slowly, that the enemy's mercy was a fiction designed to weaken resistance. And so, in those first days and weeks after capitulation, when American and British units rolled through shattered German towns, there existed a collective holding of breath, a moment suspended between expectation and reality, between the mythology of total war and the strange, disorienting humanity that actually arrived. The German soldier returning from Stalingrad or the Ardennes had some framework for understanding defeat. He had held ground, lost ground, seen the machinery of war up close. But the German mother, trained to see the enemy through the lens of existential threat, faced something more psychologically destabilizing: the discovery that her children's survival would depend not on her own sacrifice, but on the charity of those she had been taught to consider monsters. The contrast between expectation and experience began with food. In the spring of 1945, as Germany's infrastructure collapsed, as rail lines were severed and supply chains disintegrated, as the Wehrmacht's systematic looting of occupied territories ceased, German civilians faced starvation on a scale not seen since the turnip winter of 1917. The official ration in many occupied German cities fell below 800 calories per day, less than half of what a human body requires for basic survival. Mothers watched their children's faces hollow, their limbs thin, their eyes take on the glassy distance of malnutrition. They bartered family heirlooms for moldy potatoes. They boiled grass and called it soup. They waited for the punishment they had been promised. Instead, they received K rations. American field commanders, bound by the Geneva Conventions, but also by a particularly American pragmatism, understood that the occupation could not succeed if the occupied were dying en masse. General Eisenhower, despite his personal revulsion at the concentration camps and his documented anger toward German culpability, authorized the distribution of military rations to civilian populations in occupied zones. By May of 1945, American troops were distributing tens of thousands of tons of food supplies directly to German civilians: canned meat, powdered milk, chocolate bars, white bread that seemed impossibly soft to children who had never known anything but dense black loaves of war bread. The symbolic power of this food cannot be overstated. For German mothers who had spent years stretching rations, who had learned to make meals from potato peels and turnip stems, the sight of American abundance was cognitively dissonant. Private Leonard Wills, a supply clerk from Ohio, recorded in his diary, "They look at the cans like we're handing them gold." One woman kept asking if it was real meat, kept asking if we were sure we didn't need it for ourselves. I told her we had plenty. She didn't believe me until I showed her the trucks, rows and rows of them, all full. Then she sat down in the street and cried. This was not mercy in the abstract. This was mercy in the specific, tactile form of a can opener and a tin of Spam. And it arrived with a peculiar American characteristic. The GI who distributed the food often seemed embarrassed by the gratitude, uncomfortable with the weeping, eager to move along to the next block. The propaganda had prepared German mothers for cruelty. It had not prepared them for awkward kindness for teenagers from Kansas who shared their cigarettes and asked to see photographs of German children with the same fumbling affection they might show a neighbor's baby back home. The documented accounts from this period share a recurring theme. German mothers initially refused the food. Frau Elisabeth Müller, interviewed in 1947 as part of an American psychological warfare assessment, described the first time American soldiers arrived at her apartment in Frankfurt. "I thought they would take everything. I had hidden my wedding ring in the flour tin, but they came with boxes, not guns. They asked how many children I had. When I said 4, they left 4 cans of milk and a chocolate bar. My youngest daughter had not seen chocolate in 3 years. I told her not to eat it. I thought it might be poisoned, or worse, that they would return and demand payment I could not give. My daughter ate it anyway. When nothing happened, when no soldiers returned, I realized I had been lied to about everything." The psychological transformation this induced was not immediate, but it was profound. To accept food from the enemy required accepting that the enemy was not what you had been told, and if the enemy was not what you had been told, then what else had been a lie? The question metastasized. If the Americans were capable of feeding German children before securing their own strategic interests, what did that suggest about the nature of American ideology? If they were handing out condensed milk instead of exacting vengeance, what did that reveal about the moral architecture of democracy versus dictatorship? The American military government's relationship with German civilians in the immediate post-war period was complex and often contradictory. Non-fraternization policies were in place. Soldiers were forbidden from socializing with Germans, from entering German homes, from showing friendliness beyond the professional. Yet these policies were systematically ignored by frontline troops who found it impossible to maintain ideological distance from starving children. Courts-martial records from 1945 and 1946 are filled with cases of American soldiers reprimanded for sharing their rations, for giving chocolate to German kids, for playing baseball with local boys. The official policy was separation. The human reality was porosity. Captain Michael Harrington, a civil affairs officer stationed in Bavaria, wrote to his wife in June of 1945, "We're supposed to keep them at arm's length, to treat them as the enemy, even in defeat. But you can't watch a mother try to nurse a baby with no milk in her breasts and maintain that distance. Yesterday, I ordered my men to distribute our reserve rations To the families on Hauptstrasse, I'll probably catch hell for it, but I don't care. We joined this war to stop barbarism. If we become barbarians in victory, what was the point? The chocolate bar became the recurring symbol of this cognitive dissonance. Small, individually wrapped, produced in quantities that seemed impossible to European minds, still operating under scarcity logic, the Hershey's bar represented American industrial abundance translated into edible form. German children who received them often saved them for weeks, rationing tiny bites, unable to believe they wouldn't be punished for the consumption. Mothers who watched American soldiers hand out chocolate with the casual indifference of men who knew there would always be more, who had never had to choose between feeding themselves and feeding their children, began to understand something fundamental about the asymmetry of the conflict they had lost. Germany had waged total war by mobilizing every resource, by stripping occupied territories, by reducing rations to starvation levels, by demanding absolute sacrifice from its population. America had waged total war while its civilian population experienced rationing so mild that contemporary observers called it an inconvenience rather than a hardship. The American homeland had never been bombed, never been invaded, never faced the choice between guns and butter because it had produced both in quantities that staggered the European imagination. The chocolate bar in a German child's hand was material proof of this disparity, tangible evidence that the ideology of sacrifice and scarcity that had defined National Socialism was not universal, was not inevitable, was in fact the product of a particular political choice. By the winter of 1945, as the occupation solidified and the Marshall Plan began to take shape, the transformation in German civilian consciousness was documented by American psychological operations teams. Surveys conducted in the American zone showed that German mothers, when asked about their expectations versus their experiences, expressed shock and confusion at Allied behavior. One respondent, a widow from Stuttgart, stated, "We were told you would punish us by taking our food. Instead, you punished us by showing us how much food you had, how little our leaders had told us about the world. The hunger was bearable. The realization that we had been deceived, that is what starved the soul." This was not universal. There were German civilians who remained ideologically committed to National Socialism, who interpreted American generosity as weakness or as a calculated attempt to pacify the population for ulterior purposes. There were mothers who refused the food on principle, who saw acceptance as collaboration. But the archival record suggests these were the minority. For most German mothers in the immediate post-war period, the arrival of American food aid represented not just physical survival, but a violent epistemological rupture, the shattering of a worldview that had been constructed through totalitarian information control. The American soldiers themselves were often unaware of the symbolic weight of their actions. For a corporal from Nebraska, handing out cans of condensed milk was a task, a duty, something to check off before the next assignment. He did not understand that the German mother receiving that can was simultaneously receiving evidence that her government had lied to her about the nature of reality. He did not know that the casualness with which he handed over food, the shrug, the "it's no big deal" attitude, was itself a political statement, a demonstration that abundance need not be hoarded, that power need not express itself through cruelty. The epilogue of this story is written not in a single moment, but in the decades that followed. West Germany, rebuilt with American aid, became a testament to the possibility of transformation. The children who received chocolate from American GIs in 1945 grew up in a democratic state that rejected the ideologies of their parents' generation. The mothers who had expected punishment and received food aid became witnesses to a different model of international relations, one in which former enemies could become allies, where reconstruction could follow destruction. But the deeper legacy is more subtle. It lies in the recognition that ideological systems collapse not just through military defeat, but through the accumulation of small, undeniable contradictions. The German mother who watched an American soldier feed her children before feeding himself, who saw the trucks full of supplies rolling through ruined streets, who held a can of milk and understood viscerally that the enemy had more than enough. She was experiencing the collapse of totalitarian epistemology in real time. She had been told that the world was a zero-sum game, that one people's survival required another's extinction, that mercy was weakness and abundance was finite. And here, in the wreckage of total war, was evidence that all of it had been a lie. The can of condensed milk, mundane and mass-produced, became a referendum on the legitimacy of the regime that had led Germany into catastrophe. It was proof that a nation could be powerful without being cruel, that victory need not require the starvation of the defeated, that democracy, for all its complications and contradictions, operated under a different moral calculus than dictatorship. In the end, the American feeding of German children was not altruism in the pure sense. It was strategy, it was occupation policy, it was the pragmatic recognition that stability required sustenance, but it was also inadvertently a demonstration of a political philosophy in which human dignity did not have to be earned through racial purity or national greatness. It was the idea made edible that freedom and abundance might be linked, that systems built on consent rather than coercion could produce enough for everyone, even for the children of enemies. Frau Margarete Schröder, who had knelt by her broken window expecting soldiers to take what little she had, lived until 1983. In interviews conducted near the end of her life, she spoke often of that first encounter with American troops of the can of milk that had seemed like a hallucination. "I thought we would be made to pay for what Germany had done," she said. "Instead, they fed us. And in feeding us, they taught us that the world was larger and stranger and more generous than we had been allowed to believe. That is the debt we owe, not for the food itself, but for the shattering of the lie." The chocolate bars and condensed milk are long since consumed, but the lesson they carried, that power measured by its capacity for mercy exceeds power measured by its capacity for destruction, remains inscribed in the architecture of the post-war world, a quiet testament to the possibility that even in the rubble of total war, humanity can reassert itself in the simple, revolutionary act of feeding a hungry child.